But first of all, thank you for having me here.
No problem. You're welcome.
To let everyone know, we are post Beyond the Bounds, a 2-day seminar which included Aikido, Wing Chun, wrestling, kind of BJJ as well.
Yeah.
And HEMA.
Yeah.
Weapon sparring. A lot of good stuff. Good seminar. Too bad you guys missed it. But what we want to talk with you today about is something I find you to be exceptional at, and that is the weapon sparring in Aikido.
Yeah.
Which is, again, so obviously through my YouTube work, I've met a lot of Aikido guys, both real life and online, and also doing Aikido for so many years. But you're the only person that I can think of that I know that actually does Aikido weapon sparring, because Aikido people do weapons, but they're kind of static or choreographed, and there's power behind it. I'm sure we'll talk about everything about that, but I don't know anyone else beside you who puts on like legit armor, which looks badass, and you're actually designing some of it, right?
Yeah. We're actually going through the process of manufacturing our own gloves, jacket, and I suppose it's quite specific in relationship to what we do. It's based on a lot of the previous designs that HEMA have got, and what they use for their sparring. It's slightly adapted for our use.
So that's already awesome. I think we'll come back to that, and I'll touch that. I think that's exciting. And to finish the line of thought. So yeah, you're the only person I know that does Aikido weapon sparring, which is a fascinating subject, and I want to talk all about that really deeply. So
definitely, yeah.
So where do we start? So let's start with the whole question of why. So you're practicing Aikido for how long now?
It's just over 10 years.
Just over, yeah. Well, it's a good time.
Yeah.
And you're enthusiastic about the Aikido weapons since a while, and you're also doing HEMA. Which, can you explain a little bit about HEMA to people who don't know what it is?
So HEMA is basically historical European martial arts. It encompasses a whole range of different things, such as saber, longsword, wrestling, things such as catch wrestling, Indian clubs. So it encompasses a whole lot of range of subjects. It's impossible to specialise in all of them, but it's basically a broad description is anything that fitted within the European history of what people might consider to be martial arts or martial arts training.
Also, I think what is important to mention, from basically you introduced me to HEMA, and what I again find fascinating is that it incorporates real life sparring with full-on armor. So can you say a few words about that? Like, how much of a part is that for HEMA?
Yeah, it's quite I think an integral part in terms of applying everything that you learn from the drills that you might do, any sort of partner practice work. Obviously in Japanese martial arts, where you'd have your kata in your different forms, you have a similar concept in HEMA, where you'll have different partner practices or plays that have come from historical references, books, manuals, and those are practiced, and then obviously through trial and error people will try and see how they can apply them in sparring.
So leading off from that, Aikido is infamous for oftentimes lacking sparring, and there's only one style I think there's a couple of styles in Aikido which have sparring or competition, but the famous one is Shotokan Aikido, which most people call Tomiki Aikido. But it has knife sparring, like it has the knife attacker, but it doesn't have weapon sparring.
Yeah, and even I think, I mean, I could be wrong because I'm not a specialist in that area, but from what I understand, it's knife defending, or people defending from a knife attack, as opposed to it being knife fighting as such.
Right,
so even then, it's weapon. You look at it more from the side of weapons defense rather than weapon fighting, really. Right.
So again, not that we're aware of any Aikido style which has weapon sparring, but there is a lot of weapon practice. It's basically the sword, the staff, knife, in a way. So there's a lot of katas or partner practices, but a lack of sparring, or I would say a lack of sparring. So can you tell your opinion about the whole scene, and how would you describe the scene, and what do you think about the whole?
In terms of how if there is any other practice out there, or you mean
Well, just the whole situation. How do you feel about the situation that there are, and I feel that there are weapon practices, static weapon practices, but very rarely, if ever, actual sparring. So how do you?
I,
What do you think about the whole situation?
I suppose from my perspective, because I started HEMA whilst I was doing Aikido, and that's where I got my interest, because I was generally always interested in the weapons side of things. And when I'd seen, obviously we'd been sparring in HEMA, and it wasn't really a main focus, but it was always at the end of the class we'd have a bit of a spar, and it kind of then sparked my interest on how would we spar with weapons in Aikido, or how would you apply? I suppose it's more the application of the techniques that we learned, and I think, generally speaking, like you say, the majority of, or not, I don't know of any other clubs that really do push it to that level where they're sparring. People might try out little techniques in a sort of really controlled environment where they don't have any protective gear on, and obviously there's only a certain amount of force or that you can use in that scenario. So, and what I find is that it just creates a limit to where you can actually go, and really an understanding of the movements, because there's certain things, until you put it into a sparring context, that you really truly understand how some of those movements work, or how they're applied, for example, in real time. And I think it's important to understand where they fit in, and then when you then implement it into the static training, if you like, the partner practice, whether it be the Kumijo or just your solo practice, even you're understanding what's happening, what you're doing, rather than it just doing movements for the sake of doing movements.
So that makes me curious to ask. So what did you discover when you started sparring? Because so you did sparring with traditional European weapons, and now suddenly you're taking your Aikido practice, and let's come back to the moment where you started that. What was your experience? What did you discover and eventually learned?
I think the time that I actually started, it was, I can't exactly pinpoint when it was, but it was a gradual transition, I think, because we were obviously using the longsword, and then the length of the longsword is very similar to the length of a Jo, and you find there's a lot of similarities. The way that it moves, it falls somewhere in between a Jo. A katana is somewhere in the middle, in the way you can apply some of the movements. So it was interesting that I started to make links, and I think, okay, well, how would we then look at sparring with a Jo? And we experimented with different types of Jo, different types of protection that would spar with, and it was just a general exploration, mainly through the Jo. With the katana, it's slightly different, because obviously we've got the wooden oak bokkens, but they don't make a steel version that you can use for sparring in the same way that you can get a steel version of a saber or a longsword that's specific for sparring. So I think that's something from myself personally that I'm actually exploring, in terms of actually getting that developed, along with the armor and the gloves. And then slowly, I think that's something that we're looking to progress towards, because again, I think that's a whole other area that we can look at.
So one part which was fascinating for me, and so I did Aikido for a while, and I did the weapons. Weapons were quite emphasized in the style I did. No sparring though. But last year I was here visiting you. I was invited by you. We set up a meeting with Colin Fieldhouse.
Yep.
HEMA expert. I don't think he wanted me to call him expert, but I call him.
Yeah. It's very humble.
Yeah. But and then we put on some armor. There's a video of that,
yeah.
And we sparred. And obviously, I didn't even have a Japanese sword. It was a saber. It was different. But still, that was there was for me that experience of like the Aikido versus MMA. It's like, my goodness, I've done these movements before, but I didn't do them in these circumstances, and you kind of feel like you were I kind of felt like I was swimming on dry land, and now I just jump into the water. I'm like, oh my goodness, there's a
Yeah.
lot to learn before I can implement that. At the same time, what was interesting during the weekend, this weekend that we practiced, you show directly how the longsword and the Jo actually have a connection, and I was surprised by how easily I tapped into it for your
Yeah.
help because of the similarities. But still, we didn't spar, so I didn't
Yeah.
test it out. But that being said, what was your experience like when the very first time, if you remember that, or the very first kind of period where you learned Aikido weapons for a while, and then suddenly you have the chance to spar with these weapons? What were your insights the first time you did? What was the experience?
I suppose it's realizing that there's how quickly things move,
Right.
and how you've only got a limited amount of time to apply. I won't say techniques, but just being able to move, and how quickly and how much you have to shorten down your movements, and as well that you're limited to, really, I would say, when you're engaging with someone, I'd say you're limited to about 3 maybe exchanges. When I say exchanges, maybe 3 strikes or thrusts,
Right.
before either you're disengaging
Right.
or you're ending in some sort of grapple,
Right.
or you've been hit,
Right.
or you've hit the other person. So it's usually, I'd say, 3 exchanges, and then something's going to happen. There's going to be some sort of
Right.
exchange. It's I think it's very impossible for it to last any longer without it being choreographed, or that there being some sort of play where you're actually letting the person, or giving them the opportunity to come in and continuing the movement on. So I think that's I mean, that's evident in when you're practicing longsword and any of the other HEMA practices. You notice that.
Right. Well, one thing you reminded me of, it's one of the conversations we had while we spent the weekend together. Kind of the analogy that came to me in regards to weapon sparring, from what you told and what I experienced, and the combat sports or modern martial arts
Yeah.
that I'm slowly getting to know, is that let's say in boxing, and I said that while I repeated for the audience. So in boxing, there's like 6 different strikes: jab, cross, left hook, right hook, uppercut, uppercut, and it's not about, and you can take those movements and work with them for life and kind of adapt them, modify them a little bit, but it's still like those 6 strikes mainly, and that's fascinating for me, and how efficient they can be, and you don't need to necessarily know 1,000 different strikes. Again, like Bruce Lee
Yeah.
said, I don't fear the man who knows 1,000 kicks. I fear the man who's done a single kick 1,000 times. And it seems so. So when I remember when I practiced Aikido weapons, there were not too many, but a bunch of techniques, like 20 Josuburis, and even them, some of them are like a mix of like accumulation of a few different movements,
Yeah.
and then the 31 kata and kunijo. It's kind of a assembly of most of them, but there's still like additional movements. So there's a bunch of movements you learn, uh, but then uh, but then in sparring, it sounded, from what you told, it sounded like it does come down a little bit like to that kind of a boxing analogy, where you do come down to finding your favorite moves, which work best, like kind of the highest percentage ones, and then you stick with them. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what was your experience with that?
Yeah, well, the way that if you like, in my mind, I'd simplified it down to three different areas, and it's really to do with the ranges. So you've got your thrusting range, which is the closest.
Right.
I'm taking out of I'm taking out any grappling, but if we're talking about just pure strikes or thrusting range is the nearest one. Then after that, you've got your two-handed strikes. And then after that, your one-handed strikes, and one-handed strikes gives you the most reach,
Yeah.
and each have their place, and there's variations, but you can simplify it really down to those three areas. And I found that one-handed strikes you use a lot, because you're utilizing the length of the Jo, really, and you're using the distance, and obviously they're maybe not practiced as much in the when we normally practice the saburi, or that comes a bit later on. And there might be other strikes, such as to the knee, where you're coming around and striking the knee. And to be honest, that has never for me come up in sparring. Whether it's because for me it's a personal preference, whether it's not really practical, or for any other reason, I'm not sure. It's still exploring that, really. But for me, the most common ones, really, like I say, is thrust. Always comes up a lot. But again, even with the thrust, the purpose of the thrust is sometimes different to maybe how it's practiced, because sometimes I like to have that idea of it being a bit like a jab, where you're kind of judging the distance sometimes. So it might not necessarily that you're looking for that full-on strike, or thrust straight through the person, but you're actually looking to maybe create an opening. Maybe you're trying to get reaction out of the person, so they move their jaw to the side, which leaves you open for a strike. So there's all these other reasons, and until you actually start exploring that and playing with it, you don't really start to see these openings and the different ways that you could use it. So yeah, like you say, it does actually simplify down. I think with the saburis and the kata, I think for me personally, what I've taken from it more is being able to move from movement to movement, and I think that's the important thing, rather than looking at them as being individual things that you're always going to string together. It's just giving you a freedom of movement, and realistically, like you say, there's only so many ways you can hit someone.
It's not about quantity, it's about quality.
Yeah, and I think that's why I quite like when I did, like you mentioned in the seminar, where I'd shown the longsword practice, and I'd tried to relate it to the jo, because there's only certain directions which you can actually strike the body, and I've tried to relate it to those different directions. And like yourself, who you may never have done longsword before, but because you've done jo, automatically it's clicked, and you think, okay, it makes sense, and you can transition very easily, and it's actually more of a it's a very logical way of looking at it, of how to do it.
So I have still actually a bunch of questions, but so one direction I want to slowly move towards jump, but it depends on you. Tell me if any question is too much, just tell me. I cut it out, or we don't talk about it. But because I don't want to get you into trouble.
Yeah. I've got a feeling where this is going, but yeah, I'll tell you if it is. Yeah.
And also you can always answer like in a kind of a gentle way. But so not pushing it, but again speaking in a gentle way. But why do you think the sparring aspect is not, with the weapon sparring in particular? We could take it the whole level to the body techniques, but we're not here to do that today. But the weapon sparring in Aikido, why do you think it's not practiced? What's your personal opinion?
My personal opinion is probably because people are concerned about the competition aspect. As soon as you start with the sparring, then that leads on to, or the natural progression is towards competition. And I think because of the whole philosophy around O-sensei and not wanting to have that competition there, I think it's probably to preserve that. Now, for us personally, I've entered in competitions for HEMA before, and in the club when we spar together, generally we would spar without actually thinking about without thinking of a point system as such. It might be a case of, if we're coming up to the end of a sort of sparring session, we might say, okay, next strike, we'll call it a day. We might do that, but we don't tend to focus on that. And it's quite evident when you spar whether who's got the advantage. Maybe we don't necessarily need to keep a track of points for it. And especially what we tend to do is we'll record a lot of what we're doing, so we can then review it, analyse our sparring. We can see how we're doing, if there's any mistakes that we're making repetitively, openings that we're always leaving. We can see that, and we can try and then correct it. So I suppose the method in which we spar, we tend to focus more on that rather than some point system. Because as soon as you go into points, you're having to think of, well, is the head more points than if you hit the body, and if you hit the arm or hit the leg, is that different points? So you're getting into all of that. So rather than focusing on that, we tend to not go into that, and I think that's probably why people are a bit worried about going into that area.
What do you personally think if there would be a movement towards that? Let's say this thing spreads, it becomes it picks up interest, and more Aikido dojos start to spar, and someone is yearning for that or asking for that competition. What would be your personal opinion about it? How would you?
I'd love to link up with other people. If other people are interested in doing this type of training, it will be good to get ideas from what other people are doing, share ideas. Train with other people, because obviously when you train with someone else, it's very different. The way that their body moves, sometimes it can catch you off guard, because when you train with the same people, you're used to the way that they move, and then obviously when you've got someone else different, they've got a different skill set, things can change. So what I'd like to do is hook up with other people and share people's thoughts, and see if it is something that people want to try and push forward. And it's not a case of where we're saying that everyone has to go out and go on full on sparring, but sometimes the way we introduced it gradually with some of our students was to actually, for example, just have someone have one particular attack that they're attacking with, and then the other person has to maybe defend that and counter, and then after they've drilled that a few times, then the other person can react how they want in response to that counter attack, and then you build it up. So you build up that, so it's not as such going on just full on sparring, but you're kind of building up this like you say, live drilling. So there is a sort of natural progression, and I think just going back to what you'd mentioned before, it kind of links in. I suppose one of the concerns is losing precision, because when you start going into live drilling, because you're doing things faster, for example, your footwork, it might be slightly out of time. You might be, you might not be in the correct posture, and these are things. Obviously, when you're in static positions, obviously you can train it better, and you can gain better position. And I think obviously you start to lose that, and I think there is that feeling amongst a lot of people that if you do too much of that, then it's going to end up a bit chaotic, and you're going to lose the form. And I think that's what a lot of HEMA practitioners have got quite well is especially the ones that focus a lot on the form and they do a little bit of sparring at the end. They've got a nice balance where they're getting the precision and then they're trying to apply it. You do get some people who only spar, but then they're losing out on the form. And I think having a balance between the two is key, really.
That naturally leads to the question of dog worms.
Yeah.
So, if somebody does not know what dog brothers are, can you describe them in your own words?
I mean, I've only watched a handful of their videos, so I wouldn't say I know everything inside out. So, but from what I understand, they've come from a Filipino arts background. So things such as Kali, a screamer, and but they seem to run these events in the US, and I've seen some in Europe as well. And basically, it seems to have come from stick fighting. From single, double stick, your staff similar to the Joe. I've seen them use like machetes, all sorts of different weapons. 3-section staff. They're very experimental, which I quite like. But one of the things they're kind of renowned for is I suppose the lack of armor or anything. They wear a mask, don't really wear anything else, and you see them get into these. Bouts where people are coming out with bloody noses or whatever, and from injuries they've sustained from their bouts. So they can be quite. Some of them can be quite full on. Not all of them, but some of them can be quite full on. So yeah, they do try and really try and apply what they're practicing.
So what would you say makes the practice you're developing and Dog Brothers different, and what would be pros and cons, would you say?
I suppose the analogy I draw between the two is if you compare something like MMA to bare knuckle fighting. You can't just because someone is really good in the cage and someone's good at bare knuckle, you're not going to say one is necessarily better than the other. They're just different skill sets for different scenarios. They're different ways of live practice. Yeah. So I think with the benefits of the way what I'm looking at is having that balance between someone who wants to spar, but maybe they want to spar in what they feel is a safe environment. They've got, for example, what we wear. We've got the armour that we wear, the jackets, and any sort of padding. It's enough for people to implement what they know. They can use the force, but it doesn't necessarily injure the other person. The other thing that I've noticed that we tend to do a lot more than the Dog Brothers, and I think it may be because of styling with Aikido, to do a lot more thrusts. So, for example, with the staff, where you see a lot more strikes that you might have with, for example, longsword, we do a lot more thrusting as well. So that's, I suppose, a big difference, and that's why you need kind of a lot of padding protection on the sort of chest area. So, but then some people will also obviously argue the fact that they're wearing less protection, so they're
More realistic.
yeah, more realistic. That'll be the sort of arguments that people will say. I mean, I've seen other videos, not necessarily from the Dog Brothers, but other people where there are videos out there where people spar with no masks on, and they're literally crazy. I mean, but so yeah, I'm not saying that but not everyone wants to wants to do that. There is a sort of aspect of having that safe training environment. If you're teaching this, if you've got, it's okay for individuals to do that, but if you're running a club, you need you want your students to come back. You don't want them to be in hospital. So it's kind of being sensible, and I think from our perspective, we're trying to adopt more of the HEMA methodology of having that balance between the two, really. Another thing as well with the Dog Brothers, which I suppose is different from our method of training, is that for example, if they're striking towards the head, obviously they're wearing a mask, and a lot of it is just continuous bashing, of that person. So whereas I suppose the position that we look at things is, if people weren't wearing a mask and you're in that same position, if you've got that strike to the head, then pretty much you've won. And I think that's similar from, there's other styles of I forget what they call it now. I think it's M1, the medieval
MMA.
Medieval MMA, where they're in the cage or ring, and they're kind of bashing each other with a sword. Again, some people, they get more excited about that over HEMA, because they say, well, they're not starting, they're not stopping, But again, if you watch those, they don't thrust, and as well, they're cutting on armor, which it doesn't make sense. You'd be half sword, and you'd be looking for the gaps underneath the armors, in the mask, that type of thing. So the way that we're training is the idea of wearing that's just purely there as protection. As soon as we've got a strike, we accept that. Okay, as long as it's a significant strike. I mean, we're not talking about if you're just tapping the person. If there's a significant strike, particularly towards the head, as far as we're concerned, we kind of restart and then carry on. So it's pretty much the same as what you'd see in HEMA.
That reminds me of, I saw it both on video and actually in real life. A long time ago, I went to a Kyokushin karate tournament.
Okay.
And I'm so excited to see karate guys spar and whatnot, and then it eventually actually came down to black belts, and the black belts. So I saw that, and I heard multiple people later comment that they saw the same. they would close into each other, and because it's full contact. I
Yep.
think they don't strike to the head. They
Yep.
can kick to the head if I remember well. But what I really vividly remember is they just bashed each other in the core. They're just
Yeah.
just bashing and bashing and bashing each other. And I'm looking at it, and I remember back then I was like a big fan of Masayama, the founder of Kyokushin, and just like I was looking at everything, and I remember I was looking at that. I was at the same time thinking in my mind about karate katas, all the precision and all the precise movements and all the techniques. And I was like, where is that? Where did that
Yeah.
disappear? And I
Yeah.
think I'm just thinking from the top of my head. I would need more evidence, but I think it's a legit thought. Like if you, that's maybe one of the reasons why you don't see a Kyokushin guy dominating in like an MMA fight, because first of all you're not used to striking to the head, which is a criticism Taekwondo has as well, because it can be a finishing strike. But also, yeah, you won't knock. It's very very difficult to knock someone out with a punch to the core area, and so that's I could see that as a valid criticism, that it's you're practicing something, but you're not necessarily practicing something which is entirely translatable or entirely makes sense in what it's actually about. It almost
Yeah.
seems a little bit like the Dog Brothers versus Yima, where you recognize that a strike to the head would be final, and you do disengage, and if there's like a killing blow, and yeah, there's a bit of a more sense of giving the understanding to the practitioner for what it's really about.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, across the world, there's loads of these type of examples of, in Thailand, for example, where they've got Krabi Krabong, which is their sword fighting. They'll have various competitions, which when you look at in practice, the way that it might be practiced, it has these lovely fluid movements. But then when they actually get into sparring, it's bam, 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 bam,
Right.
and it's if that was actual, if they were actually sparring with swords, they wouldn't be doing things that way. You wouldn't, and actually, it's not just a matter of the person attacking. You wouldn't be wanting to throw yourself in kamikaze style into that situation where someone's got two swords flailing at you. You would be more careful in the way that you do things. So I think in that respect, and I've seen that, and I've seen where potentially people would win from the first strike, but then it's really then afterwards down to fitness and who's the fittest person, who's going to keep on going until they basically smother the other person, and it then doesn't really become about the skill of using the weapon. It's more about just general fitness then.
Which then I'll articulate. Then it seems HEMA and the approach that you put on the weapon sparring in Aikido, that's addressed.
That's the way that I like to think it, because then I think that keeps the balance of still having not letting it get out of control. It's still trying to keep everything when I say controlled, in the sense that you understand when something's finished, and you've got those sort of definite finishes. If people, for example, if something is a bit, well, I'm not sure whether that was a strike, we'll just carry on. And like I say, and I think that's, again, when it comes down to point systems, that's when things start to change, and where you start to think, well, was that a point? Was it not a point? And if you get too caught up in that, then I think that's when you start having issues.
I think so. One thing you did address to some degree, but I think it is important to redress. One more reason why I personally think the weapon sparring is not part of Aikido. So definitely what you said, the whole philosophy dilemma, but also from a personal experience, the whole safety question.
Yeah.
And I remember myself in my teens when I started training Aikido. We're a group of teens, all ambitious, and we do want that competitive aspect. And when our sensei was not around, we'd sometimes take the bookends and be like, let's do some sparring.
Oh, yeah.
And we wouldn't hit to the head; it was more to the core. But we would feel that this is dangerous.
Yeah.
And sometimes you would get like hit in the fingers, and it was like, ow, really, like on a big level. and that, but we would feel like limited. We would stop eventually, or soon enough, because we would feel like if we continue, the pace just keeps getting higher, and there's a sense of danger, and you just can't keep on going. And I think when I thought about that, or I didn't think I even spoke about some high level Aikido people back in the day about that, about weapon sparring, it would always stop at that idea of, well, it's like maybe you wear kendo armor, but then the kendo thing, again, we looked at a video today, that dramatically, the kendo itself, the way it's done, it dramatically changes the kenjutsu, the traditional weapon style.
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't practiced kendo, so I don't know it inside out. But from my understanding, it's quite limited by the rules that it has. Right. If you've seen when we watched the video earlier, where right. you have that engagement when they close the gap and they're both pressing the swords up against each other. Well, in that position, you'll be looking at grappling. You'll be looking at trying to disarm the sword. You'll be looking at you wouldn't be just standing there pressing up against the sword, but they seem to do, and it happens regularly when you see them spar. But it's because it's still quite heavily steeped in culture. So rather than it just purely being about the application of the weapon, the other thing as well that changes is when you actually, and this is actually something that I explored recently in some videos that I did in relation to the Jo, the type of material that you're using for sparring obviously changes things dramatically. So for example, if you're using foam, plastic, or for our case when we use rattan as a substitute for oak, using all those different materials, it changes the way it feels with the Jo. Back when we were first training longsword, before we moved on to steel, it was quite common, and I think still nowadays people still use nylon swords, so it's basically your plastic swords. Now when you're first using it, obviously when it's new and you think, oh, this is great, but then after using steel, it's like it just feels so floppy. It feels so unrealistic using that. But when you use it at the time, it feels quite good. So and it's kind of the same when you're using a wooden bokken. You don't realise how much different it is going to using steel, because with steel things change a lot. The way that the swords bind together, it makes a big difference.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up is because part of the inspirations for this conversation on record is because we discussed that there may be people who might be excited and interested about this, but they may be bumping into that same issue of, oh no, we can't do this because we'll kill each other way too soon. So I know more or less the answer from our conversations, but to let the audience know, when you wear full armor, when I say armor, maybe some people think like medieval armor. I obviously mean like specially designed armor.
I think it's protective gear really.
Right. Yeah. So when you wear protective gear, how dangerous or safe is it?
It could potentially be quite dangerous. I know people who've broken their fingers from using plastic plastic swords. So and that's with plastic. People it could potentially escalate even further. Obviously with steel, there's still a certain element of control that you have to have with steel. Obviously the more protection you have, the more you can put in, and it's finding that balance between having enough protection where it's not like you're just in a full suit of armor and you're like a tank walking at someone. You don't care whether you get hit or not, but you need to have something there where you don't want to get hit. You need to have that feeling of not wanting to get hit. If you're fully padded up, and I suppose you'll know from your own experience when you've been in ring, if you're fully all padded up, you're going to
have a sense of safety.
You've got that sense of safety. So and you need to have that feeling of well, I might get hit. I don't really want to get hit. But obviously when people start off, if they're worried about things, I remember when I first was worried, and I used to hear about people breaking their fingers with the plastic swords, and you get worried about it. But then now, after we're using steel, you don't really think about it. I wouldn't, but you get more comfortable. You get more comfortable when you, obviously, the more skill that you progress, you get, you can use, heavier weapons, for example, and you just generally get more comfortable in that environment. But I think what I'd always say to people is just take it easy to start with. Use something like, you can get foam swords are readily available, foam staff, they're all there, so you could use something like that, light sparring to start with, and then slowly build it up, slowly escalate it, rather than just jumping full in and thinking, right, okay, I need to go all out to start with.
So you keep mentioning broken fingers, and from what I've heard in the conversations we had in the past, I remember that that's actually one of the challenges, the issues in the armor that I think you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
But aside that, I think most people are concerned about having their head bashed in. It doesn't sound like, I don't think that's a common thing.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the masks that they've got are pretty good. I mean, obviously,
actually, because I feel like, I think you're actually pretty safe considerably. I mean,
yeah,
especially if you're concerned about your life while sparring. Right?
Yeah, I mean, we've got masks that, I mean, obviously, with you've got other martial arts such as, fencing's
Right.
been around for quite some time. I know it's different, in a sense it's more thrusting, but still, I think with masks they have developed them where they can take quite a heavy impact. They've developed covers where you can cover the mask as well, so there's a certain element of protection around the sides and back. So generally speaking, the head is relatively well protected. It tends to be the gaps in the joints, and for example, any parts of your arms, or if you start using steel, it's the worry if the steel breaks, then that potentially the sharp part of the steel puncturing through the protection.
Yeah, but this is like kind of the low percentage.
That is, it's very low percentage, but still there is that danger aspect there. But obviously, if you're using, and I suppose this is why at the moment we're focusing more on the staff, because with the rattan, it's you have that safety. Everything, there's no sort of sharp edges. It's all blunt. You're looking at even with the thrust, everything's blunt. So even though it might hurt, it's not going to be the same amount of damage as what you would get with a steel weapon.
So let's say someone. I'll push one more step after that. But let's say someone gets excited, right, and they live across the world. By the way, we're in UK, right?
Yeah.
In
West Yorkshire.
West Yorkshire. But let's say somebody gets excited, in Asia or the States, and they want to spar, and they want to be safe, and they want the armor. Can they contact you?
They can contact me. I've got friends in Thailand that do things such as Krabi Kabong, where we've looked at options of helping them out with some of the armour that we're looking at producing. Like I say, we're still in our early stages, but yeah, by all means, if they want to contact me, we can explore those options. If someone's local to here, or if they're in the area, welcome to get in contact and they can have a look at what we're doing.
Because I imagine myself in that situation, if I'd be like, it's time to spar, and I'm like, where do I get the armor? I don't know if there's like a decent provider, or I think it's still a developing area.
Yeah, I think with the HEMA stuff is getting better and better now, because before it used to, people used to just use whatever they could get. For example, hockey gear or motorbike jackets, motorbike equipment. So that tends to be what it used to be like, and then now it seems to have modified where there is actually their own specialized equipment, and obviously that's getting better and better, so a lot of that equipment can be used. But even when you're talking about from longsword to saber, so for example, the hand protection that you need for a saber isn't quite as much as what you need for a longsword. So again, tailoring it to knowing what you want to spar with depends on, you might not necessarily need that same level of protection, and really it's being smart about what level of protection you need, because the other thing to think about is it's nice to have that fluidity of movement. And I suppose going back to what we were saying with the Dog Brothers, that's I suppose the beauty of and one of the advantages of their practice. They're not bogged down by all the armour or, as you say, protective gear, because it makes a difference in terms of the stamina that you have, the restriction of movement. So it's the pros and cons, and you've got to basically weigh them up against each other.
So nearing to the last section, who would you say, coming back specifically to the Aikido world, um, what would you say would be the benefits of sparring with weapons? Why do you feel people should consider that, or yeah, or might consider that?
I suppose if people have got the interest in the weapons, it's actually showing them how they can apply what they're learning. Like you say, when you mentioned before, when you were first starting out, you wanted to spar with weapons, you wanted to have a bit of a go, especially when people are younger, they want to, they want to have a play around with these type of things. So I think in that, it gives people that platform to be able to do that. Like I say, you start to learn how to apply things. And as well, I think it gives you that that pressure to deal with that pressure, and also apply that pressure, and not be overwhelmed by someone coming at you. So and learning how to deal with that helps you with the footwork, and dealing with things in real time rather as opposed to just all the time where in partner practice where it would be slow time, or even if in a controlled environment. So I think it'll help a lot of people that way.
Nice. So once more to mention that one of the inspirations for having this conversation for us on record was the realization. I think we both came to the same realization, but I can speak for myself. Like personally, I there's actually multiple things from what I know of you personally. There's multiple things actually I feel you do uniquely, which would provide value. So I'm like, why is it not out there? But talking about like weapons, like sparring in Aikido, that you already have developed some experience, of the armor, of the weapons. You're developing the katana version of sparring.
Yeah, we already actually we've developed two before, but both of them are way too heavy for sparring. I mean, they're okay for just practicing, but no way you could use them for sparring. They're way too heavy. So that's still in its infancy. So yeah, once we've fully got there with that, I think I'll start putting up some videos in relation to that.
So I definitely feel like you have developed and still developing and evolving like kind of a gateway to the Aikido sparring, weapon sparring, which many people might benefit and be interested in. So to make sure that whoever is, so that they would know enough about you, could you say a few words? So you run a developing YouTube channel and you run a dojo.
Yeah.
So can you tell a little bit about that, so people would know what you're working on and how to connect?
Yeah. So the dojo that I run, obviously it's geared around Aikido. We do body techniques as well as weapons, but we're quite heavy emphasis is on the weapons. Right. So and I leave it open actually for students to choose whether they want to spar. I don't put that pressure on them. If they want to spar, that's up to them. So we do that. It's something that we're looking at trying to get more students in. Obviously, Aikido, it's not that popular as much as other martial arts, and particularly when we're talking about weapons. I think a lot of people don't even know that weapons is actually a part of Aikido. Yeah. So that's one aspect. I'm looking at trying to develop that more. In terms of my own personal YouTube channel, it's again, it's geared a lot around the weapons. Recently I've put up a series of videos looking at staff sparring, analysing that, the different types of staff, as I mentioned before, that we can use in sparring, right. And also how some of the techniques can be applied in sparring and the application of them. And then there's just general tutorials. So that's something in terms of the weapons side I'm building up. Also, I'm quite into a lot of flow art, so that's also another side of what I look at. And
not everybody knows what
flow art.
It's a quick definition there.
Quick definition. Flow arts, it basically encompasses anything from, people probably might be familiar with fire spinning, maybe that's right. More of a general term, but anything from, although I don't do yoga, it kind of fits within that aspect of flow arts, but it's anything that kind of generates that feeling of flow in your movement. So it's a lot of the weapons, maybe from, if you think of the Shaolin type of weapons, like the 3-section staff, or even with nunchuckers, all this type of stuff, where it's taken out of the martial aspect and that people use it in a more flowing or performance aspect. And I think that's generally where the flow arts community fit in. With me personally, I find that helps me complement with what I do in martial arts, because I find a lot of the weapons in martial arts have lost that aspect of things, and I find they both complement the two, and what I like to look at is bridging the gap between the two. That's particularly applicable for, if you remember at the weekend we did some Indian clubs and some club swinging. I think club bells is quite popular, for example, in the US. Indian clubs not so well known in the UK. It used to be really popular, particularly in the early 1900s. It was in the Olympics. Again, that's something that seems to have fallen out of favour. That's something that I'm looking at, because I think, again, for martial artists, I think it's really good, particularly people who are into weapons. It's a really good form of training. So again, that's something that I've focused on my YouTube channel as well.
So if people want to find you,
AikiFlow. So it's they can either contact me, Alex at AikiFlow.uk, or website again, AikiFlow.uk, or the YouTube channel if they just search for AikiFlow.
And one confusion I want to get out of the way straight away is there is a famous YouTube channel known as Aikido Flow.
Yep.
So the difference is the dough is not there, and the reason your dojo, it wasn't by no means influenced.
No, it was actually, yeah, it was something that we've had, because I was teaching Aikido, I was teaching flow arts as well, AikiFlow, and so for me, Aikido and it's Aiki and flow, and using those two principles of Aiki and flow, and I think I was basically doing both things together, created a dojo, and then the YouTube channel came out of that. So yeah, it's completely separate.
I wanted to bring that out because I know some people might be like, hey, you're copying Aikido Flow. But no, when I learned the reason why your dojo is called AikiFlow, I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Well, good. So basically the message is that there's definitely value behind sparring with weapons in Aikido. It's accessible. It's not widespread, but there's a lot of stuff in there, and as far as I know you, then if anyone is interested to try it out or wants some tips or advice, or wants to do some work with you, then they
definitely more than welcome.
Cool. What else did I want to say here? Oh yeah, I wanted to also put out that you tend to travel.
Yes, I travel quite a lot, quite extensively, yeah.
So in case somebody can't make it to UK, they might be excited to know that you might be in their area. So what locations do you often visit, and expect to find you?
This summer I'm thinking about possibly going to be going to St. Petersburg. Last year I actually drove there. I don't know if I'm going to do that again this year, I'll see. I might do. Later in the year I'll probably end up in Southeast Asia. I'm usually there at least once a year, so around Thailand, Malaysia type of area. And then next year I'm looking at doing the Mongol Rally, so I'll probably be driving across Central Asia at some point next year. So those are the plans for the coming year.
So if someone is around in that area, look out. So yeah, that wraps up my main questions. Is there anything else you want to specifically put out yourself?
No, I don't think so. Not in particular. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah. Thank you for your time.
No problem. You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Seminar. I think this has great potential, and I hope that some people will see an opportunity here, and this may become a thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think for next year, if people wanted us to focus on that for the following year, it'll be really good.
That could be like an interesting thing for people, like Aikido with weapon sparring.
Yeah.
I'm sure a bunch of people might be interested to come down.
Yeah. Good.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.